Good evening. I would like to welcome you to our lecture series, The United States and World Affairs, the Cold War and Beyond. Our speaker today is one of the nation's most eminent and most well-known historians, Professor H.W. Blanton of the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you for coming today. I'm Klaus Lares, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor in History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I would like to thank the generous sponsors, the many generous sponsors behind the Krasno Distinguished Professorship for making possible this lecture series on the US in world affairs. As you know, we have had a great number of interesting talks this semester in our lecture series, the US in world affairs, and also in our Ambassadors Forum. There are many more exciting events coming up next semester. By now, I'm sure you're wondering what you can do to enable us to put on further lectures and talks in the future. Please don't hesitate to talk to me afterwards, if you're interested. In a little while, the lecture today will be available on our YouTube channel. All our previous talks and also the talks in our Ambassadors Forum can be viewed there. The address is, as you will know, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. And as you know, all these talks and lectures are extremely good, and you ought to watch them as often as you possibly can. It is a great pleasure today to welcome Professor Bill Blanton to UNC today. Professor Blanton is among America's most distinguished and well-known historians. Much of his scholarship is focused on American political and social history and on penning very readable biographies. Henry William Blanton was born in Oregon. He went to college in California, and he earned graduate degrees in Oregon and Texas. But Bill Blanton did not only get a graduate degree in history, but also one in mathematics, which is kind of unusual for a historian. And in between, I understand Bill sold cutlery across the American West. Bill Blanton taught at Vanderbilt University and Texas A&M University before joining the faculty at the University of Texas at Austin. He now holds the Jack S. Blanton Sr. Chair in History at UT. Bill has written numerous books, 25 in total, I understand, plus a few co-authored ones for good measure, as well as a huge number of articles. I have no idea when Bill Blanton finds time to get any sleep. Bill mostly writes on American history and politics, and his books have been translated into many foreign languages, including Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Ukrainian. His many books include, for example, The Man Who Saved the Union, Traitor to His Class on Franklin Roosevelt, Andrew Jackson, The Age of Gold, The First American, and a book on Teddy Roosevelt, TR. Several of his books have been bestsellers, both in hardback and paperback. And two of Bill's books, Traitor to His Class and The First American, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize. Bill also lectures frequently on historical and current events, and he can be seen and heard on national and international TV and radio. And also, most importantly, of course, today he can be heard and seen at UNC-Chapel Hill. Professor Brandt's talk today is entitled Who Won the Cold War? Reagan, Gorbachev, and the World They Destroyed. There will be time for questions afterwards. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure and honor to present to you Professor Henry William Blanton.
Thank you, Klaus, for that kind introduction. Thank you all for coming out on this chilly evening. I'm delighted to be here. I teach at the University of Texas at Austin, and I have large classes of undergraduates this semester. And I sort of flatter myself that my classes are relatively interesting. But I know perfectly well that if my students weren't going to be examined on the material, if they didn't have to come to class, they wouldn't come. I'm always flattered to speak to groups of people who don't have to be here. Now, some of you look like you might be students, so maybe there is a little bit of incentive from your teachers. I hope so. But anyway, the rest of you I'm gathering are not students. So as I say, I know full well that you could be at home, you could be having dinner, you could be doing all sorts of other things, but you chose to come. And I find that very flattering. I'm going to be speaking on, well, the title, Reagan, Gorbachev, and the World They Destroyed. Who won the Cold War? Yeah, that's what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to set it in the context of some larger issues. The longer I teach history, the more I become convinced that the basic questions of history are almost matters of philosophy, matters of psychology, matters of human nature. So I'm going to be talking about Reagan especially, and Gorbachev. I'm going to be talking about the end of the Cold War, but I'm also going to be talking about the question of causation in history. How do big events like the Cold War end? Are they dependent on individuals? Did it really make any difference that Ronald Reagan was president during the 1980s? Did it make any difference that Mikhail Gorbachev was this opposite number in the Soviet Union? Would the Cold War have ended the way it did? Would it have ended about the time it did, if not for these two individuals? I have been, as Klaus suggested, I've been writing history. In fact, I started writing history in the realm of foreign affairs. So my first couple of books were on American foreign policy during the 1940s and 1950s. From there, I segued into writing sort of broader history. I found myself falling into, I'll call it the historian's trap, or the tendency of historians, since we are inclined to look to the past to explain the present. Well, once you've looked to the past to explain the present, then at least I have this tendency to look farther to the past to explain that part of the past, and farther back and farther back. I started writing about the 1950s. My dissertation, my first book, was on the Eisenhower administration's foreign policy. And I found myself doing the research in the obvious sources at the Eisenhower Library, the National Archives. And one of the things that you discover when you write about post-war American foreign policy, actually most issues of post-war politics and the like, is that you will never be able to get your arms around all of the material. The material is simply too vast. The presidency, the American government has become, well, so multifaceted. There's so many people who work for it. They're all generating paper. There's no way you can see it all. So the farther I went back into the past, the more I was drawn to the idea that a person could actually get his hands around more and more of the extant record. Until I finally got all the way back to the 18th century. I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin. And while the Eisenhower Library, in fact, I'll just tell you now, that my current project, and the reason I'm talking about what I'm talking about, is that my latest book is going to be, I just proofread it, it's off to production, it's biography of Ronald Reagan, in which Reagan's foreign policy, the end of the Cold War, plays a very large part. Well, there are something like 60 million documents at the Reagan Library. And there's no way one historian in a lifetime is going to be able to cover all of that. Contrast that. And so there's this giant library. How many of you have been to the Reagan Library in Southern California? Any of you? Okay, it's like all the presidential libraries. It's this vast warehouse with a museum and a reading room in the front. And there's no way that anybody's going to be able to cover all this stuff. Compare that with, I wrote a book, as I was regressing, on Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin, the entire corpus of Benjamin Franklin's works are actually encompassable in about this much space. There is a great edited collection of Franklin's papers. It's been under production since the 1950s by the American Philosophical Society and Yale University Press. And it is about this much. It's something like 35 volumes. They're not quite to the end. But there it is. And the idea that I could actually read everything that still exists that Franklin wrote was very intriguing. So I wrote about Franklin, and then I had this idea that I was actually going to write a history of the United States in the form of biographies. And this speaks for two reasons. Number one is that there's something about me that likes to find the individuals in history. And maybe it's just a literary thing. I've written what sort of is social history. I've written sort of broad-gauged economic history. But it's really hard to make that into a story. Stories have to have actors. Stories have to have characters. So I decided I was going to tell American history through the lens of biography. So Reagan is the sixth of 6 volumes in this. And to just make a plug for the previous volumes, the first one, and Klaus mentioned a couple. The first one is The First American on Benjamin Franklin. Andrew Jackson is Volume 2. Ulysses Grant, The Man Who Saved the Union, is Volume 3. T.R. on Teddy Roosevelt is Volume 4. Traitor to His Class on Franklin Roosevelt is Volume 5. When I got to Volume 6, I had to figure out who I should write about. Now, one of the things about these biographies, for my purpose, first of all, is that the reason they pass for history is that I believe that every biography is a life and times. And so, with my design that this would be a history, I was going to focus on the individual but broaden out to include the times. I needed somebody, Franklin Roosevelt died in 1945, so I needed somebody to pick the story up from there. And I wanted somebody to carry the story through pretty much to as close to the present as possible. I was thinking about particular individuals. I was drawn very much to writing about Richard Nixon. I thought Nixon would be good. And for the biographer, for the historian, Nixon is really appealing because there is this dark streak in Richard Nixon's character. And as Tolstoy, among other people, said, it's a lot more interesting to read about unhappy people and complicated people and people with dark streaks than to just write about happy people. And at least at first, the last person I thought I would write about was Ronald Reagan. And this is where, and I look out here, and I see that many of you share a characteristic that I do regarding Reagan, is we lived through his presidency. Not all of you, and I teach undergraduates, and these are, I have to think about it, I have to remind myself of this, that Ronald Reagan is as far from their lives as almost Woodrow Wilson was from my life when I was in college. And so for them it's history. For me, for many of you, it's my life, and one could say sort of current events, but now it's receding into the past. And I will ask you to consider this, because I had to deal with it. In many ways, it's a lot harder to write about events that you lived through than it is to write about events in the distant past that you had no personal experience of. And I'm going to tell you the conclusion that I drew, and this is based on my own experience, but it's also on my experience of interviewing people with respect to this project and other projects. And that is that everybody thinks he or she is an expert on the times that they lived through. And they're all wrong. And this becomes especially obvious when you interview people, for example, who have participated in wars. And I have interviewed people who were at war. I've used oral histories, the recorded recollections of people who lived through wars. And the reason that they think they're experts on the subject is they were there. And they knew what it was like to hear the bullets zinging past them and what their sector on the front was and all this. And so, yes, they are experts on that particular moment. But it is a human tendency to extrapolate from the personal to the general and think that the war was like what I saw of the war. Well, wars are much bigger than that. Anyway, I really didn't want to write about Ronald Reagan. And the reason I didn't want to write about Ronald Reagan was that I lived through Reagan's presidency. And I guess I won't be giving anything particularly interesting away to say that I had two chances to vote for Ronald Reagan, and I didn't vote for Reagan either time. I shared a view common among, shall I say, intellectual types, academic types, that and just a whole lot of people, that thought that Reagan was essentially shallow, and that he had no particular expertise, especially in foreign policy. He had been governor of California, the nation's largest state, so it gave him some executive experience. But what did he know about foreign policy? What did he know about dealing, for example, with the Soviet Union? And so, of course, he had been an actor, and the easy conclusion there is that he was simply mouthing lines that were written by other people. So, for the longest time, I thought Reagan would not be sufficiently interesting. Oh, and the other thing was that he did seem to be this boringly happy guy. And what can you make out of that? There is precedent for... There's a particular reason that I thought the way I did. Are any of you familiar with a book that Edmund Morris wrote on Ronald Reagan called Dutch? Okay. Edmund Morris, a brief story here. Edmund Morris is, I guess he was born in what's now Zimbabwe. And he was a journalist. He wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt. It was published in 1979 or 1980. A really good book on the young Theodore Roosevelt. It ends with Roosevelt getting the news that William McKinley has died. He's going to be president of the United States. It was a surprise bestseller. It won the Pulitzer Prize. And it came to the attention of Nancy Reagan, just after her husband was elected president of the United States. And so Nancy Reagan was thinking, what historian can do justice to my Ronnie? And that's what she always called him, Ronnie. What historian can do justice to my Ronnie? Why this new guy who is interestingly enough, not infected with the liberal bias of a lot of American historians and intellectuals, because he's from Africa. And he obviously is on a roll, and he can really write, so let's bring him in. So Edmund Morris was brought into the White House. And I mean, I was in graduate school at the time, so I was vaguely aware that Morris had this unprecedented access to a sitting president. Historians, as a graduate student, I was studying Eisenhower at the time, I would have killed to have this kind of access to Eisenhower even in the White House. Because there are plenty of moments when I'm reading through the written record and I'm trying to figure out what, for example, Eisenhower makes of this. And if I could just ask him a few questions. Well, by then Eisenhower was long dead and there was no way to ask him the questions. But to be able to sit in on meetings with the president, to interview the president at length, to have the approval of the president and the White House staff and the First Lady, so that everybody else would talk to you, it had the makings of perhaps the best biography of a president ever written. And Morris had this access, he had the writing chops to be able to do it. But a strange thing happened, because everybody knew that the book was going to await Reagan's departure from the White House. That went without saying. And it was probably going to await Reagan's memoir, because you're going to clear the field and let the president make money on his memoir. And then we're going to see the book. But the book just didn't come out. And years passed, and people wondered, what's going on with this book? And when it finally came out, if you know the book, you will remember it was horribly controversial because it was horrible. And it was horrible because it was, if you can believe this, it was a fictionalized biography of the President of the United States. Nobody had ever done such a thing. Now, one imagines what must have been going through Edmund Morris's head. And I can piece this together because I've encountered Morris on a few occasions, and I've heard him give interviews. And I will give you my best reconstruction of what happened. Morris signed this really big contract for this book on Ronald Reagan. And the number that was quoted was $3 million. And back in 1980, that was a lot of money. It's still a lot of money for a book like this. But it was really a lot of money then. And he got into the story, and he discovered that unlike Theodore Roosevelt, who was an intrinsically interesting person, Ronald Reagan was an intrinsically dull person. And if any of you have read any works by Morris, he wrote this trilogy on Theodore Roosevelt. One volume pre-presidency, one volume of the presidency, one volume post-presidency. And I bet Morris would be the first to admit that the presidential volume is the least interesting of the three. Because there's something very predictable about the presidency. The presidency, I wrote a book about Theodore Roosevelt, and I'll tell you that the years of his presidency were the least interesting years of his life. The presidency really made him calm down in a way that he didn't like to be calmed down. Which is to say that Theodore Roosevelt is an apt subject for a riveting biography, even if he had never been president of the United States. Ronald Reagan was just the opposite. If Ronald Reagan had not been president of the United States, no one would have been interested in his life. Because it just was not interesting. He was a little bit better than B-list movie actor. He had been a politician in Hollywood. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild. He was governor of California. I mean, that was on his career path to the White House. But in terms of what he was himself, the kind of stuff that he did, the thoughts that he had, the material for a biography, I'm pretty sure that Morris, who I actually have heard him say is bored by politics, had nothing to work with. Well, with Reagan, it's all about politics. And if not for the politics, there's no reason to write about Reagan. So Morris decided, how am I going to tell this story? How am I going to spice the story up a little bit? So Morris creates this alter ego, and it's told through the eyes of this fictional alter ego. And people who had been waiting, especially Reagan loyalists, Reagan fans, who thought, okay, this is going to be the great book on Reagan. And members of the administration, members of the family, were simply insulted when the book came out. Because, what? you didn't take this guy, this President of the United States, seriously enough to write an honest, straightforward account of his presidency. The book created a big splash when it came out precisely because it was so unusual. And then it sank without a trace. The one thing that I sometimes worry about is I have graduate students who they read for their comprehensive exams. And they often make up their own reading list, and they go through the library and they pick out these books. And I can imagine, because I know that the book is shelved in bookstores. Actually, it's not in bookstores anymore. But in libraries, it's shelved with straightforward biographies. And I can imagine a poor graduate student who is quizzed on Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and refers to this biography of Ronald Reagan, Dutch, by Edmund Morris. And I imagine that the members of the committee are sort of looking at each other uncomfortably. Doesn't he know that this is fiction? Anyway, so I thought, so what is there to write a biography about Ronald Reagan? Well, the more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that I probably ought to do it. One reason is that I had written about, let's call it sort of the heroes of American liberalism. The two previous biographies were of Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. And I probably owed it to myself to write about a hero of American conservatism. But the other thing was, the more I thought about Reagan, the more I became convinced that there was a fundamental puzzle at the heart of this guy's story. And the puzzle is this. Now, first of all, I'm going to have to see if I can get you to agree with me that Reagan is worthy of attention. But and the way I'm going to say this is that I'll just state my thesis straight out. Ronald Reagan was one of the handful of greatest presidents in American history. And by greatest, I don't necessarily mean best or worst, but I mean one who had the greatest impact on the way America worked, the way Americans lived, the way the world worked. And in fact, I came to the conclusion that Ronald Reagan was, with Franklin Roosevelt, one of sort of two bookends of the 20th century, or two bookends of the second half of the 20th century, the American century. Franklin Roosevelt is the one in foreign policy who launches the United States on the path of globalism, on which the United States has remained ever since. But Franklin Roosevelt was also the father of the American welfare state. Social Security, the various other programs that would give rise to Medicare, and the idea that government is there to support people when the private economy, when individual effort fails. Some of you will know that Ronald Reagan, as a young man, considered Franklin Roosevelt his hero. Ronald Reagan was a New Deal Democrat in college and as a young man, as an actor in Hollywood. Ronald Reagan voted for Franklin Roosevelt 4 times. What you might not know is that Ronald Reagan, through the end of his presidency, still considered Franklin Roosevelt his model for presidential leadership. And this kind of took me a little bit by surprise. By this time I'd been reading lots of Reagan speeches, and about the time I started in on the book, Reagan's diary became available. Now this is really interesting, but it also shows sort of what Reagan was thinking. Ronald Reagan never kept a diary, except when he was president. And the diary begins with an entry for January 20th, 1981. And the last entry, January 20th, 1989. He kept the diary. So I asked myself, why did he keep the diary? Why did he start the diary? Why did he end the diary? The conclusion that I drew is that this was going to be an aid to writing his memoir. He had actually already written one memoir when he first went into politics in the 1960s. So he didn't really have to go over that ground much more. But it was a way of remembering what he did on given days, so that when he wrote his presidential memoir, there it would be. And in fact, if you've read his presidential memoir, An American Life, he quotes extensively from his diary. But as is often the case with diaries, he sort of forgot why he was writing it. In the early going, you can see that he realizes that posterity is looking over his shoulder. And so he's writing for that future audience. But as is often the case in this sort of thing, he gradually forgot about the audience, and the diary takes on a life of its own. So when I started thinking about writing about Reagan, this diary all of a sudden became available. And it gave me a chance to get inside this guy's head. Now, this is the goal of every biographer. You want to find out what your subject is thinking. And I discovered something that I hadn't guessed, that he was thinking a lot more than I had thought before. And that he was thinking more interesting and, now I'm not exactly going to say deeper thoughts. Because Ronald Reagan was, I say this with no pejorative intent, Ronald Reagan was an intellectually shallow person. But I'm going to elaborate on this in a little bit, because one of the things I'm going to say is that one of Reagan's great strengths was precisely his intellectual shallowness. Okay? I'll get back to that. I wanted to write about Reagan because I became convinced that Reagan's presidency was one of the greatest in American history, in the sense that things changed while Reagan was president, to a greater degree than can be said of probably more than 3 or 4 other presidencies in American history. American politics took a sharp turn to the right in a conservative direction during the Reagan years. Now, I'm not going to claim, in fact, we can talk about this, I'm not going to claim that Reagan was entirely responsible for this. No big events in history are the work of any single individual. But Reagan was the person who embodied this, who justified it, maybe you could say rationalized it, nonetheless made it part of American thinking. I wrote an earlier book about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is generally thought to be, acknowledged to be, the president who ushered in the age of democracy. Well, Jackson did not do it all by himself, but presidents have this ability, if they have the opportunity, if they have the ability, to embody a certain moment in history. And Reagan did this in a way that none of the presidents before him did, except for Franklin Roosevelt in the 20th century. We go back to Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson Light in the 18th, 19th centuries. And he also had a very large impact on the history of the world. The world changed while Reagan was president. And in fact, the Soviet Union was pushed on the path to dissolution. Now, again, I would never claim that Reagan was the one who did this all by himself. Nonetheless, well, in fact, we can talk about this. To what extent was this Reagan? To what extent was this Reagan plus Gorbachev? To what extent was this a fundamental flaw in the Soviet model of things? But I'm going to tell you that Reagan's foreign policy, I said that Reagan was shallow? Yeah. Reagan's foreign policy was very simple. You could even call it simple-minded. He was asked, "What is your policy?" And he said, referring to communism, because with Reagan, that was the only issue that really mattered. Everything else was subsidiary to that. What did Reagan think about European integration? Not much. He left that to other people. If it promoted the demise of the Soviet Union and communism, great. If it didn't, What did he think about policy in Central America? What did he think about constructive engagement with South Africa? All of these things were extraneous. What he really cared about was the struggle with communism. And he was asked, "So what's your policy on communism?" He said, "It's simple. We win, they lose." Now, this was Reagan's response, especially to détente in the 1970s, because Reagan, like very many American conservatives, was anywhere from skeptical to fully aghast at the policy of détente. Because détente was based on, well, to use Khrushchev's notion, peaceful coexistence. You know, when Nixon went to China and then to Moscow in 1972, he basically said, we can get along with the communists. Communists, the Soviet Union, China, they're simply normal great powers. And this was the Nixonian view. This was the Nixon-Kissinger view, the realist view of the world in the 1970s. And Reagan thought it was morally bankrupt. Reagan believed that the struggle with communism was the characteristic, was the decisive struggle of the 20th century. Now, Reagan wasn't thinking in quite these terms, but I, as the historian, was, that just as I said that Franklin Roosevelt was the father of the welfare state, Franklin Roosevelt pushed American domestic politics in a leftward direction. Reagan pushed it back in a rightward direction. But in foreign policy, the parallel is actually even more striking, because Franklin Roosevelt was the president who led the United States to the verge of, he died before it finally happened, to the verge of victory over the first mode of 20th century totalitarianism, fascism. Reagan picks up the struggle when he becomes president in 1980 and pushes the second mode of modern totalitarianism, communism, to the brink of dissolution and bankruptcy. And the question in the title was, who won the Cold War? That's actually a bit of a red herring. Because I'm not going to try to tell you that Reagan won the Cold War. I'm not going to try to tell you that the United States won the Cold War. But I will tell you this. It should be more properly, I guess, phrased, what won the Cold War? And to the extent that the Cold War was a struggle between competing ideologies, competing modes of social and political organization, between democratic capitalism and communist socialism, the democratic capitalists won. They won decisively. They won definitively. So when Reagan became president in 1981, it was still plausible to think that communism might be a reasonable model for human organization. The Chinese had started to abandon it, but the Soviets believed in it wholeheartedly. At least they certainly acted as though they did. Within a very short time after Reagan left office, nobody believed in communism anymore. In fact, by the 1990s, there was a communist party that still rules in China, but they're not communists. That's the label they give to autocracy, sort of capitalist autocracy in China. And communism, can you think of anybody today, outside of, I guess, a few aging members, tenured members of English departments at American universities that still believe in communism? This is striking, because it's hard to imagine a movement that had so many followers in as many countries as it did for as long as it did, that just went poof, it's gone. And it's hard to imagine that it's going to make a comeback. Thomas Piketty, to the contrary notwithstanding. So socialism maybe, but even socialism has a hard time gaining any adherents. But the one-party version of socialism, communism, they still pay lip service to it in Cuba, and I don't even know what they pay lip service to in North Korea. But that's it. It's gone. So notice that this happened basically between the time Reagan became president, and I won't say it was finished by the time he left office, but Soviet communism was on the brink. And by that time, there was pretty much no coming back. So this takes me to the fundamental puzzle that I have been wrestling with Reagan. I sent the page proofs back to the publisher a couple of weeks ago. There's nothing I can do about it anymore. So I've said what I'm going to say until I get to make revisions for the paperback. So I probably shouldn't even raise this, because I'm to that stage in the production of the book where I don't want to learn anymore. But I'm going to throw it out to you because I want to see what you have to say about this. But I'm going to tell you what I concluded about the secret of Reagan's success. And this applies to domestic affairs, but maybe especially to foreign policy. And one of his secrets was that very shallowness that I referred to earlier. Reagan was focused on, he was preoccupied with, maybe he was even obsessed with the struggle against communism. He let nothing distract him from that. Reagan was one of those people who knew a couple of things, and he knew them really well. In fact, maybe he knew them too well. When I was reading Reagan's diary, when I was reading Reagan's speeches, one of the striking things about Reagan's speeches, how many of you have some kind of working memory of Ronald Reagan giving a speech? Either from TV or maybe conceivably you heard him in person. One of the great things about the internet age is that on YouTube, when you're not watching the lectures from this series, you can go back and look at Reagan's speeches. Some of you may know or will remember that Reagan burst onto the national political scene in 1964, a week before the 64 election, when the struggling Goldwater campaign asked Reagan to give a speech because it became really apparent that Goldwater wasn't going anywhere. The campaign had run out of money, and they knew that Reagan was a pretty good speaker. So they bought him half an hour of airtime. And this was they purchased airtime in various markets around the country. And Reagan gave this speech. Those people in the Reagan world, ever after, they referred to it as the speech. And you can watch the speech. And I did it several times. And it's quite a remarkable speech. And for those of you who sort of like me, originally thought that Reagan was a little bit slow on the uptake and not very impressive, one of the things to remember is that Reagan was within a couple weeks of his 70th birthday when he became President of the United States. Now, there are plenty of sharp people who are in their 70s, but sharp people in their 70s would probably acknowledge they were sharper when they were in their 40s. And if you go back and look at Reagan, for example, when he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947, the Reagan there he's very impressive. Here's somebody who knows his stuff, who is very articulate. Also, and this is important, he wasn't president. Reagan, one of the secrets of Reagan's success, I'm going to say, is his shallowness, his simple-mindedness. I'll come back, hold that thought. Another secret of Reagan's success was Reagan understood that being President of the United States is a performance art. It's not primarily a matter of what you know. It's not a matter of who you hire. It's not even a matter of judgment. This or that. These or those. Although that part is important. As much as anything else, in many cases more than anything else, is can you project your vision of where you want the country to go, of what you think this country stands for. Can you do that? Can you make a connection with the American people? And this is where Reagan's tutelage under Franklin Roosevelt is exceedingly important. Reagan talks in his memoir, and he spoke many times to various people, about listening to Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats. Now, I look out on the audience, and conceivably, but I've never tried to guess people's age, there might be people who remember some of Roosevelt's fireside chats. In this internet age, you can listen to those fireside chats. And in fact, I do an experiment. I do a sort of what shall I call it, experimental history or practical history with my students. Some of you may remember, again, I won't guess your age, but you may remember that Franklin Roosevelt's first fireside chat occurred 10 days into his presidency in 1933. The country was at the worst of the Depression. The bank system had seized up. Roosevelt had declared a bank holiday, brought Congress into emergency session. They signed an Emergency Banking Act, and Roosevelt is explaining to the country how the banks are going to reopen and how they need popular support. And so this is why I set it up for my class. It's a very cold March. It might be the coldest winter in American history in terms of how the American people felt. Despair was throughout the land. And so just about this time, and I say that this first fireside chat was an experiment. Presidents had never addressed the American people like this. And the fireside chat was aired on a national radio hookup at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. Of course, 7 o'clock on the West Coast. And many people had already gone to bed. And because when you were out of money, you would turn out the lights early, you'd turn off the furnace early, you'd huddle under the blanket to conserve calories. So I have my lecture class, and at this point I dim the lights. Now, if I could, being in Texas, I'd crank up the air conditioning to make it cold, so that I'll be shivering. And then out of the speakers comes the voice of Franklin Roosevelt. And it's remarkable. The guy could give, I don't know how many of you have studied finance, but in 14 and a half minutes, he explains how banks are supposed to work, how banks had failed, how Congress and the presidency had put together this rescue plan, and how it was going to roll out starting the next day. Now, when I would talk to students in various audiences, I would say, based on my listening to this, that it would be very easy for a listener to imagine that this was the voice of a favorite uncle, or a father, basically because the message of Roosevelt was, it's going to be okay. This was a segue from his inaugural address, where he says, the only thing we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And so he's saying it's going to be okay. And so I remember giving this talk to a group that included people perhaps even older, perhaps older than some of you here. And I said that it sounded like the voice of a favorite uncle or something like that. And a woman came up at the end of the lecture and said, I heard that chat. I heard that fireside chat, and I can tell you it wasn't the voice of a favorite uncle that I heard. It wasn't the voice of my father. What she said was, it was the voice of God. And Ronald Reagan, at that very time, was a radio announcer. He got into the media business as a radio announcer. And he listened to this. And he took cues from Roosevelt. And he understood something about a president's ability to project a vision for the American people. And he understood the singular importance of an emotional connection with ordinary people. Some presidents will work their magic through dealing with Congress. Lyndon Johnson was probably the best legislator-in-chief in American history. But that gets you so far. What Roosevelt understood, and what Reagan inferred and practiced on his own, was if you can connect with the American people, you can go over the heads of Congress. You can make things happen that wouldn't happen otherwise. And Reagan understood that this connection is critical. There was something else he understood. That if a president is going to be effective, a president has to embody, exude, communicate optimism. With Roosevelt during the Depression, it was, everything's going to be okay. With Reagan, it was, it's morning in America. America is this shining city on a hill. America's greatest days are ahead of it. Now, I'm going to get back to this simple-mindedness of Reagan. Now, that's probably a little bit too uncomplimentary to Reagan. His simple views, his straightforward views. I read Reagan's diary, and I would read him talking about complicated issues in a simple way, in which the United States is always on the side of good and justice, and the other guys are always on the side of bad and all the other negative qualities. And I thought about this. I said, well, come on. Can't you put yourself in the shoes of somebody else? So, there's a moment in his diary. It's along about 1983, and Reagan has been railing against the Soviet Union as an evil empire. And he has been funding the largest arms build-up in American history. And he's building up to a 600-ship Navy, and wants to get money for the MX missile, and he's introduced SDI, Star Wars, and all this. And he says, for the first time I realized that the Soviets might feel threatened by this buildup. And when I read that, I went, well, duh, what do you think? But Reagan, it was a revelation, it was an epiphany for him. Because Reagan knew in his heart that he would never start a war, and he sort of assumed that the world knew that America would never start a war. The United States would not engage in a first strike, and so therefore, somehow the KGB ought to have inferred this and told the leaders of the Soviet Union. But he realized, maybe it's not that way. Now, this was really a revelation for Reagan, that somebody else's point of view might actually have some validity. When I was doing this book, when I was doing the research of the book, I did research at the Reagan Library and various other libraries and archives. And I also had an opportunity, unlike when I wrote about Andrew Jackson or Benjamin Franklin, to interview people who worked with Reagan, who knew Reagan. In fact, I tried to interview members of the family, and the only one who would agree to be interviewed was Ron Reagan, his youngest son. And Ron Reagan tells a story that I thought was really revealing of his father. Ron was a teenager, and in the family, the son is always Ron, and the father is Ronnie, at least to Nancy. So, Ron is watching a TV show. This is, I think it's between the time his dad is governor and he becomes president. But anyway, they're watching a TV show. And it was, I guess, on the equivalent of the History Channel or something then. And it showed that, or maybe it was just a Western, a movie, where it was really clear that, well, at least in this movie vision, the Indians are the savages and the cavalry the good guys. And Ron says to his dad, well, Dad, and I guess the father, and Ronald Reagan liked those kind of movies. And he used to watch movies. He was not only a character in movies, but he was a great consumer of movies. And Ron, being somewhat of a rebellious teenager, said, Dad, don't you realize, it was more complicated than that, right? That the Indians were often cheated by the government, and they were often massacred by the settlers, and don't you see that? And when I was talking to Ron about this, he said, I was trying to get my dad to realize that sometimes the American people, the United States government, could do something that was, not exactly up to his view of what America stood for. And so we talked a little bit more. I was talking to Ron about this, and he said his father, when pressed on this, his father could see that. His father knew, for example, that slavery had been legal for the United, in the first 85 years of America's national existence, and slavery was not a good thing. And so he said, and Ron, the conclusion that Ron drew was, my father could intellectually see that the United States was not always on the side of the angels. But emotionally, he simply could not get himself to believe that. So there was this disconnect between what his head knew and what his heart wanted to feel. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that the principal secret of Reagan's success was that he spoke from the heart rather than from the head. And he made Americans believe, he told Americans again and again, that this country is the greatest country in the history of humanity. And that Americans stand for freedom and justice and all sorts of good things. And this is what is great about this country. Reagan was a brilliant communicator. He was often called the great communicator. But one of the reasons he was so brilliant, and one of the reasons that he had the impact that he did, was he relentlessly flattered the American people. Reagan believed, to the extent that he has this cognitive dissonance between sort of what he knows here and what he feels here, Reagan believed here that this country really was the greatest country on earth. Reagan believed what Americans have always wanted to believe about ourselves. And when he said it, he could make Americans think that's exactly right. Americans responded to Reagan like they have responded to no president since Franklin Roosevelt. I'm going to stop here very shortly because I want to get reactions and questions. But when I was first writing this book about Reagan, I was trying to figure out what the title and what sort of the theme would be. And the working title was, what I had in my head was, The Last Hero. Ronald Reagan and His America, or something like that. The Last Hero. And the reason that I was thinking about that title was, the hero was actually sort of referring to the hero in mythology. The great figure who embodies the moment, the forces of his time. But the critical part was the last hero. And the reason I was going to say the last hero was that I just asked you, whether you agreed with Reagan's politics, whether you like Reagan or not, is there a president since Reagan who has the kind of stature in history that Reagan had? And you'll have your own thoughts on this, but I'm going to suggest that the answer is no. And just as a quick thought experiment, can you imagine any other president who might have gotten his name put in front of the National Airport in Washington, D.C.? Could it be, the elder George Bush gets an airport in Houston, but that was his hometown. The Clinton National Airport, the George W. Bush National Airport, the Barack Obama National Airport. Reagan, Democrats resisted, but it just, I wouldn't say it for a long time. But eventually, there it is. And I'm going to suggest that one of the reasons that Reagan is this last hero is, first of all, he played this heroic role, but, and this gets back to sort of the beginning of all of this, and that is by ending the Cold War. Reagan deprived subsequent presidents of the kind of worthy adversary that's necessary for a hero to be heroic. I'm just going to say one last thing and then I really will stop. And that is that there is an interesting paradox in American political history. And the paradox is this, that the greatest presidents, the ones ranked highest by historians and political scientists, presided over the worst times. And consider, so George Washington is usually near the top, and he's the one who comes out and has to deal with the Revolution and the turbulent early years of the National Republic. The next one you get to is Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, Franklin Roosevelt, the double whammy of the Great Depression and World War II. And if you go along with me, Reagan, who, well, we can talk about, Reagan's presidency isn't so bad, but the time that he came out of was very difficult. But anyway, American presidents can rise to greatness when they are faced with a crisis, when the American status quo is sufficiently shaken that there's an opportunity to make changes. For the most part, as much as we complain about how politics works or doesn't work, if you look at American history in the context of world history, the American political system is a rip-roaring success. There is no country that has been more successful in almost any measure than the United States over the last 250 years, 225 years, whenever you want to start. And therefore, what this suggests is that our model is working pretty well. But occasionally the model breaks down. And the clearest cases are during the Civil War and during the Great Depression. That's when the possibility arises for a president to come along and really stamp his impress on the moment. I would suggest that it is a measure of Reagan's, and I'll use the word greatness here again, large impact, that he didn't have that full-blown crisis that Lincoln had, that Franklin Roosevelt had. But nonetheless, the world was different, America was different after Reagan left the White House than it was before he entered the White House. I'm going to stop there and hope you will ask me questions, make challenges, whatever you want to do.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much for a great performance and for changing our picture about Ronald Reagan, perhaps. I think you learned a lot from Ronald Reagan. You're being a great communicator yourself. But let me ask you, because you never really answered the question, who won the Cold War now?
Okay. Well, when I said that communism is a dead letter, what I will say is that the American side won the Cold War. Was it an individual victory for Reagan? No. Because individuals, well, as Marx said, individuals make their own history, but not under the circumstances of their own choosing. Would the Cold War have ended differently, perhaps at a different time, if Reagan had not been president? Maybe, maybe not. I will say this, that if Reagan won the Cold War, he did not do it single-handedly. And this is where, I don't know if Reagan understood this, perhaps the president who understood it the best was Theodore Roosevelt, who understood that one secret of success in politics, especially for a president, is timing. And the timing is often beyond your control. I do say in the book that Reagan benefited enormously from having his career, his presidency, overlap with the time in office of two other individuals, one on the domestic side, the other on the foreign policy side. On the domestic side, Paul Volcker as head of the Fed. It was Volcker who rang the inflation out of the American economy and who was willing and able to inflict pain on the economy to bring the inflation rates of the 1970s down to the rates where they basically have been ever since. And as unelected chairman, an unanswerable chairman of the Fed, he could do it. Interestingly, Reagan was trying again and again to get Volcker to loosen the reins. But Reagan, as president, claimed credit, and in the eyes of many people, he gets credit for the improvement in the economy. But it wasn't all his doing. It probably owed as much to Paul Volcker as it did to him. And the timing here is critical. If Volcker had become chairman of the Fed 2 years earlier, then the improvement would have occurred while Jimmy Carter was still president, and Carter quite likely would have been reelected, and Reagan never would have been president of the United States. If it had come 2 years later, then, if you'll remember, the Republicans took a hammering in the 1982 midterm elections because the country was in the throes of the Depression. If Volcker had come in 2 years later, the recession would have occurred in 1984. Reagan would have been swept out of office, and one-term presidents don't get any credit. On the foreign policy side, Gorbachev is absolutely critical. Reagan tried to reach out to Leonid Brezhnev, to no effect. And then to Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko, and as you like to say, they kept dying on me. And then along comes Gorbachev, who is committed to reform. And finally Reagan has someone he can talk to. The relationship that developed between Reagan and Gorbachev is fascinating, because Reagan was one who said and firmly believed that the Soviet Union was an evil empire. And he was willing to impute evil to the people who ran this empire. But he discovered, well, it's sort of like his, that they actually have reason to fear the United States, that Gorbachev was a person like he himself was. And Gorbachev had a vision for the Soviet Union, had a vision for humanity, and one of the visions that they shared was potentially a world beyond nuclear weapons. The story of Reagan and SDI and nuclear weapons is a fascinating one. And like very many other people, when I started in on Reagan, I assumed that Reagan had sort of a turning point in his thinking about weapons and the role of weapons in diplomacy. And during his first term, it was all about building up. But then in his second term, he discovers that, history is going to deal with me, so I'm going to have to try to reach out and form a peaceful bond with the Soviet Union. But in fact, the farther I got into it, the more I realized it was all part of a single policy. And Reagan, from the time he was governor of California, certainly before he became president of the United States, was opposed to the very idea of nuclear weapons. He believed that there should be a world beyond nuclear weapons. Reagan thought that the strategy of mutual assured destruction was a moral abomination. The idea of holding the human race hostage to these nuclear weapons was utterly terrible, and something ought to be done about it. And his whole strategy was to get large reductions in arms. But he believed that the only way to get the Soviets to come to the table was to build up America's arsenal so that they would realize the U.S. is serious. Why should the Soviets give away anything if the Americans are going to sort of not make any resistance? So I see, and I think Reagan himself saw, that this was all of one piece. And there is... Have you had Ken Edelman come speak here?
Okay, no, not here, but I've heard him in D.C.
Okay, yeah, so he's got a relatively new book out. And it's called Reagan at Reykjavik. And it's about the Reykjavik summit of 1986. And it's a fascinating moment. And this is one where I like to tell my students that there are two kinds of history. There's big history and little history. Little history is the history of individuals. It's what biographers look at. Individual life and the role of a single person. And it can be a president of the United States. It can be an ordinary person with an ordinary life. Big history is a history of nations. And it's a history of war and peace and big treaties and agreements. Reykjavik is this moment where little history intersects big history. And you see Reagan and Gorbachev coming to grips with this idea that there could be a world beyond nuclear weapons. There could be a world where humans do not live any longer under the nuclear shadow. And luckily for me, the American note takers and the Soviet note takers kept really good notes, and everything has become available. So you can follow the discussion, and they go at it, hammer and tongs. Now, before Reagan went to Reykjavik, Richard Nixon, who knew something about arms control policy, said, my God, don't let Reagan get in a room alone with Gorbachev. He'll give away the store. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And Nixon was not entirely wrong. But one of the really interesting things was that when you read the transcripts, it's pretty clear that Gorbachev didn't know what he was talking about either. At least in terms of the details. But they both understood that they had their detail people waiting in the wings. If they could come to an agreement, if they could say, all right, we are going to agree that over the next 10 years, we are going to eliminate nuclear weapons, then we can get our people to work out the details. And there is this moment. I try to be as dispassionate and objective as I can when I'm sort of writing about people in history. But occasionally, what one of them does just makes me want to reach out and just grab them and say, come on! And Gorbachev says we can have a deal on this elimination of nuclear weapons, but all you have to do is agree to keep SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, in the laboratory for 10 years. Now, I benefit from hindsight. I know that SDI came to nothing over the next 10 years and came to precious little at all. And so I know that if Reagan had just said yes, then there could have been this deal. Now, there are complications to this. Each one still would have to get a treaty ratified. It's not at all clear that the Senate would have gone along with this. It's one thing, it's worth remembering that Reagan was sorely criticized from the right in the last 2 years of his presidency for being too soft on the Russians. Margaret Thatcher, when she heard what went on at Reykjavik, almost had a heart attack. Because Thatcher knew, as everybody on the American side in Europe knew, that it was the American nuclear deterrent that offset the Soviet large advantage in conventional weapons. And as, I think it was Jack Matlock who said that when Thatcher heard about this, she came down like a ton of bricks. And Margaret Thatcher was about the one person who could lecture Ronald Reagan and tell him, no, this is crazy, you can't do it.
Apart from Nancy.
Nancy's a very interesting story. Nancy didn't lecture Reagan. Nancy worked on Reagan by other means. But
like now we want to go have no
okay.
more.
I mean, I will tell you. I had sort of the stereotypical, the caricatured view of Nancy Reagan, that she was this sort of smiling first lady who was there just being pretty on stage. One of the attractions of writing about Reagan was that this was an administration where the various members of the administration despised one another. And they all wrote about it. Donald Reagan was the first out of the block. Reagan got fired by Nancy because Nancy thought that Reagan should have prevented the Iran-Contra. And she was probably right. So she had him fired. At which point he came out just 6 months later and began his memoir with, on page 1, with the story of Nancy's astrologer. Well, this was, it's great sort of watching Reagan as president. He's still president, dealing with this at press conferences. So, Mr. President, have you heard from your astrologer lately? And he tries, wave it aside. But this is one of the things that I will say that at times I was charmed by Reagan. It's really clear that Reagan's relationship with Nancy was one of, I'll call it one of the great love stories of American public life in the 70s and 80s. Nancy Reagan was utterly devoted to Reagan, and Reagan was utterly devoted to her. But here's, you decide whether this is scary or revealing or what. Ronald Reagan had essentially no friends, except for Nancy. Now, I'll tell you, I got a little bit of insight on this. You make of this what you will. So I had done a book on Ulysses Grant, and I was doing a radio interview. And so at the end of the interview on Grant, the host says, "What's your next project?" I said, "I'm working on Ronald Reagan." And he muted the microphone. And he said, "After we get off the air, I want to tell you something." Okay, I'm all ears. We get off the air. And he says, "If you want to understand Ronald Reagan, you need to remember that Reagan was the son of an alcoholic." Now, this is no secret. Reagan has written about it. Reagan wrote about it in his memoirs. But he said, and I said, "Okay, I'll elaborate." And he said, "Well, I'll tell you, I know something about this because I'm the son of an alcoholic." And he said there is a characteristic emotional reaction to people who grow up as the child, but especially the son of an alcoholic father. Because the person in your life, the role model, the person that you want to depend on, the one you want to look up to, is a guy who one day is your best buddy and he's throwing the baseball around with you and telling you all these stories, and the next day he's beating the daylights out of you, or he's lying drunk in the snow. So Reagan, in his memoir, Reagan tells a story of coming home from school at the age of 11 in Dixon, Illinois. And he sees his father passed out in the snow. And Reagan said this in public in his memoir. He says, "I had to stand there for a minute and ask myself, so what do I do? Do I drag him inside? Or do I just let him sit here and freeze?" and he gave it some serious thought. And then he eventually got his dad inside. And so this radio guy that I was talking to said, yeah, and you grow up having this kind of emotional reserve because you know you can't count on anybody. Because this person you want to count on most emotionally, you can't count on him. Well, with Reagan, this is really observable. And Nancy, I think Nancy's memoir is one of the most revealing memoirs it is the most revealing memoir by a first lady I've ever read. In part because she had to deal with things like this astrologer story. And it's the real deal. And you might think, what a wacko. But I have to, and I tell the story in the book. Nancy was, from the time Reagan became president, she was worried for his safety. Presidents had been assassinated. Presidents had been shot at. And hardly a month into Reagan's presidency, he is shot and nearly killed. And Nancy responds to this. I think, oh my God, if I lose him, I won't be able to carry on. She was so devoted to him, so attached to him, that she really thought that she could not live if he died. And so she's trying to figure out what can she do to prevent this happening. Now, having spent a lot of time in Hollywood, she was talking to one of her old Hollywood buddies, Merv Griffin, who said, there is this woman in Hollywood, turns out her name was Joan Quigley, basically the astrologer to the stars, who might be able to help you. And so Nancy talks to Joan Quigley. And Joan Quigley says, I could have told you that March 30th was a bad day for your husband. Now, Nancy was not stupid. So it's a measure of her distress and her need to just cling to something that she didn't immediately discount this retrospective prediction. After he knows that the guy is nearly killed, he says, I knew that was a bad day. She didn't have notes and wrote it down ahead of time. She's just telling her, oh, really? And so Nancy came to believe that there were good days and there were bad days. And so when Reagan was going to schedule something, she would run it by Joan Quigley. For example, travel. She was deathly afraid that Air Force One was going to go down, be shot down or have malfunction or something. So is this day a good day or not? And Don Regan just went nuts about this because he's a chief of staff of the president. He's trying to schedule stuff, and we can't leave for Reykjavik on Thursday because Thursday's a bad day, according to this woman in San Francisco. And so, so what Nancy says apropos of Reagan's emotional life was, there were times, she said, I was closer to Ronnie, and she always called him Ronnie, even in the memoir, I was closer to Ronnie than anybody else, which was quite true. But there were times when even I didn't know what was going on, when he would pull that curtain down, and I just had to keep my distance. I think that if Ronald Reagan had not been President of the United States, no one would have come to his funeral. He didn't have any friends. There was Nancy. Nancy would have come. The kids maybe would have come. The story of Reagan and his children is, I guess it's an object lesson in don't be too busy for your kids. There's a poignant moment in Michael Reagan's memoir. So Michael is the oldest son, and Michael was adopted, and so there's that complication. And then he was the stepson of Nancy, there's that complication. And they were busy, and they shipped him off to one boarding school after another where he acted out and got kicked out and this and that. But finally he's about of a time and age where he's going to graduate from this boarding school in Arizona. But he doesn't have the credits, he doesn't have the grades. But he cuts a deal with the school that if he can get his dad to come give the commencement address, his dad at this point I think he's governor of California, if his dad will come and give the commencement address, then they'll give him his diploma and out he goes. So Reagan comes, and he's like a politician, he's working the room. And he's going down the line of the graduates. He says, hi, I'm Ronald Reagan. What's your name? John Smith, I'm Ronald Reagan. What's your name? And he comes to Michael. And he says, "Hi, I'm Ronald Reagan. What's your name?" And Michael says, "Dad." So, what do you do with something like this? I don't know. Other questions?
Look, let me ask one more question. Let me open it up. Let me try to be devil's advocate.
Yeah, okay.
What you present to us is biography.
Yeah.
Really, the history of the world by means of great men or great women,
Right.
if you take Nancy. Is that really how we should do it? There's social history, there's history from below, there's structural history. So basically not looking at men and women as individuals,
Right.
but look at development, look at events, look at recessions, look at the working class, and
Sure.
so on and so on. So why is it justified to do what you do?
I'll give you 2 or 3 responses there. In the first place, the reason I wrote this History of America through biography is that I pitched the idea of a 6-volume history of the United States to a publisher. This is back in about 1992. And the publisher laughed in my face and said, "Nobody writes that kind of stuff. Nobody would publish that kind of stuff. Nobody would read it if it was published." And then, and here I'll get us some sense of potentially the age of some people in the audience, when the publisher then said, by your response to this, the publisher then said, "Who do you think you are anyway? Will Durant?" Okay. Those people who know who Will Durant was know that Will Durant and Ariel Durant wrote this 25-volume history of the world. The story of civilization. And I was thinking, what I wanted to say was, yeah, I hope to be. Because I hadn't read all of them, but I read a lot of them. And I found something very engaging about having this one voice that guides you through this big sweep of history. But the publisher said it's not going to work. So I was discouraged for a time. But then I thought, maybe there's a way to do this covertly. I would write it, but I wouldn't call it a history of the United States. I would instead write a series of biographies. And I'm mercenary enough to pay attention to what sells and what doesn't. And if you look on the bestseller lists, when history shows up, it's very typically in the form of biographies. This was just about the time that shortly after David McCulloch's biography of Harry Truman almost single-handedly resurrected Harry Truman as reputation politically and sold, 1.5 million copies or something like that. And I thought, yeah. But there was something else. I had been a history teacher for a while at this point. And I knew that all sorts of people have had a bad experience of history in high school. That they thought of history as memorizing a bunch of facts and dates and matching the fact with the date and the name and this and that. And I don't know if this is more true in Texas than it is in North Carolina, but you'll catch my drift. When I say that a lot of people they think they can't remember the last name of their high school history teacher, but they're pretty sure that the teacher's first name was Coach. And so a lot of people have this unfortunate experience of history. And when I would talk about, I'm writing this history of, for a lot of people, I'd get just a couple words past history of, and their eyes would start to glaze over and go, I don't like history. But if you say you're writing about people, we're interested in people. People want to learn about people. This is why people write and read novels. So, one of the reasons that I decided to write it this way was simply to get that literary hook, to bring people in. And when I talk to my students, when I lecture to students, they love the stories about people. And having written this, if you can write, you can write about people. It's hard to write about movements. It's hard to write about classes in an engaging way. And I'll be quite frank in saying that by the time I launched on this, I safely had tenure. So I didn't have to write for the academy anymore. I could write for a larger audience. But beyond this, there is sort of this question, I alluded to it earlier. When I talk about little history and big history, and the two, if you want to understand history as history, you have to pay attention to both. Now, there are those people who believe that there is some kind of zeitgeist that is almost transcendent of the individuals involved. I don't happen to buy into that. I happen to think that history is, I'm going to go so far as to say it's no more, big history is no more than the sum of a lot of little histories. And if you could know all the little histories and get the people, because I'm not a determinist, I believe that humans can do things, that they have what amounts to what looks like free will. Now, I will say that something like the Industrial Revolution is way overdetermined. Take away James Watt, take away any number of inventors or entrepreneurs, and you still get an Industrial Revolution. I would say that there are intermediate events. So, World War I. Okay? World War I is not as overdetermined as the Industrial Revolution. If Franz Ferdinand had taken a different turn that day, there might not have been a World War I. There were tensions in the world, but did they have to take the form of war? We were talking about this earlier. I happen to think that there are moments when individuals can be absolutely decisive. I'm not going to put Ronald Reagan in this category, but I will say that, if you will recall, that between the opening of the Berlin Wall in November of 1989 and the unification of Germany the following autumn, 11 months passed. It wouldn't have happened on that time frame. I'm not going to say it wouldn't have happened at all, if not for, at least on the American side, the elder George Bush. Because most of the other leaders of the Western Alliance said this is a very bad idea, and we certainly shouldn't do it as hastily as this. But Bush decided he would throw in his lot with Helmut Kohl, and they were going to make it happen. If not for Bush, if not for his particular, I'm going to say his faith in the German people, it wouldn't have happened. And that's a big deal. So sometimes big deals hinge on individuals. Since we started with the Cold War and Reagan and Gorbachev, as I tried to explain, there was a lot to this. I happen to think that, the Reagan loyalists, the Reaganauts, they would point to something like as specific as SDI. And when Reagan announced SDI, that was an announcement, we're going to spend you guys into oblivion. And therefore, Gorbachev has to cry uncle, and that's that. It's really interesting when you read the transcripts from Reykjavik, because Gorbachev says, we're not going to chase you off into outer space. We're going to counter SDI, but not by the same means. What he seems to be referring to is the fact that a lot of people said at the time, you can defeat SDI just by building more offensive weapons. SDI is not going to be perfect. It can shoot down 9 out of 10. There used to be a bumper sticker back in the 70s or 80s that said even a single nuclear bomb can ruin your day. So a few of these get through, and the system simply doesn't work. You got a question, sir?
Yeah, I think you're onto something here. I think, first of all, I'm of Ukrainian origin, so I've actually had a lot of access. And I can tell you that in 1988-89, my parents invited some Soviet Ukrainian diplomats. And what they were amazed at, they were in shock, these diplomats. They couldn't believe how Gorbachev had entered into power and how he had disassembled the Kremlin. And I think what you have here is two personalities who get together and have an undue influence. I think, first of all, Reagan understood at some point that the Soviet Union was falling apart. And he gave him a soft landing. And he used all his charisma, all his persuasion to make it easier. In that sense, it could have been a very different outcome.
I think you're right. And one of the things that Reagan did not do was to gloat as the Soviet Union was falling apart. And I think this has a lot to do with the relationship he developed with Gorbachev. Because they spoke to, especially at Reykjavik, but following that at Washington, they had another summit in Washington, another one in Moscow. And they both are talking about the political difficulties that they deal with. And Reagan is saying, I got these conservatives back in the United States I have to deal with. And Gorbachev is saying, I got my own hardliners too. And Reagan, one of the striking things about Reagan was he was really good as a negotiator. And this kind of goes back to the time when he was chief negotiator for the Screen Actors Guild in Hollywood. And here's something. When I did interviews for the book, I didn't learn a whole lot that surprised me. But the way people said things, I found very useful. Reagan, as you probably know, is considered to be a saint by every registered Republican today. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not the first one to say this, I won't say most of them, but a lot of them would be appalled at the stuff that Reagan actually did. Because here's another secret of Reagan's success. Reagan from that first speech in 1964 till his farewell address in January 1989, essentially gave the same speech again and again and again. And it was chapter and verse of conservatism. And oratorically, rhetorically, Reagan was the perfect 100% conservative. But as a politician, as President of the United States, Reagan was a practicing pragmatist. And Reagan is the one who's identified with cutting taxes. Reagan cut taxes essentially, 1.5 times. And he raised taxes 7 times. But that's the part that is forgotten. But, talking about these interviews, I was talking to James Baker, who was Reagan's Chief of Staff and then Secretary of Treasury and eventually Secretary of State. And he gave me a quote that it was very much in line with something I had concluded myself. But coming from Jim Baker, it was perfect. And I have it word for word because it made such an impression on me. Baker said, if Reagan told me once, he told me 15,000 times, and that's the number he used, 15,000 times, I would rather get 80% of what I was asking for than go over the cliff with my flags flying. And that was Reagan's approach. Reagan understood that politics, or more precisely governing, is the art of the possible. If you can get 80% of what you're asking for, take it and run. You've made a big improvement on the status quo, and you can always come back for the rest. So Reagan was this pragmatist, and that's the part, and that's one of the reasons that Reagan can still be embraced by conservatives, because they focus on the speeches. And you can quote Reagan again and again. He's saying everything that even the Tea Party likes. But if you look at the way Reagan governed, Reagan has fallen into, he's moved into that category where Barack Obama has cited Reagan favorably.
Shouldn't, when we look at the end of the Cold War, shouldn't really credit go much more to Bush the older, Bush Senior, rather than to Ronald Reagan? Ronald Reagan was out of office by then.
What I would say is that Reagan made possible what the elder Bush followed up on. By the spring of 1989, and it really, as you know, it's only by the summer of 1989 that the Bush administration has conducted its review and is actually starting to embark on a policy. By then, the Berlin Wall was almost open. The momentum had developed for the changes that swept across Eastern Europe and into the Soviet Union. By the way, back to the original question, who won the Cold War? I would say everybody won the Cold War, in the sense that people who lived under communist rule were, certainly most of them in Hungary, Ukraine, a lot better off after the Soviet Union has dissolved. Vladimir Putin might dispute this today, but in terms of how is the world going to be organized? Is it going to be organized on principles that give a greater stake to individual freedom or in state authority? And when I write these books, I really try to avoid rendering value judgments on, was Reagan's SDI policy wise or foolish? I just say, here's the policy, here's what he thought it was, here's what the critics said, and you, dear reader, draw your own conclusions. Okay?
Thank you.
But this is one where I'd be quite willing to say that pretty much everybody came out better.
Thank you.
At the end of the Cold War. Yes, sir.
Listening to you initially call Reagan a shallow.
Yeah.
It seems to me there's a tremendous contrast between Reagan, Gorbachev, and Obama, Putin.
Yeah.
Just opposite.
You mean the relationship between the two?
Well, and Obama, you wouldn't call him shallow.
No, right.
And Putin wasn't flexible. I mean, the four people are just so drastically different.
Yeah.
Reagan and Gorbachev could talk to each other. Putin and Obama can't talk to each other.
Yeah, a couple of comments on that. The first thing I would say is that when I said that Reagan was shallow, I actually didn't follow on that sufficiently. What Reagan understood was that even as President of the United States, as leader of the free world, as arguably the most powerful person in the world, you can only hope for success on a few identifiable objectives. If you spread yourself too thinly, you get nothing. So Reagan had two goals when he became president: shrink government at home, defeat communism abroad. And everything else was detail. And he left the detail to other people. And sometimes the details got out of hand. And that's how the Iran-Contra scandal blew up and nearly destroyed Reagan's presidency. Reagan was a terrible manager. Actually, just the opposite of Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was a whole lot smarter than Reagan in terms of mastery of the details of policy. But Jimmy Carter did not, first of all, know the value of focus, and he also did not know the value, the importance of performing the presidency. Carter would have been a great chief of staff. Carter would have been a great advisor, but he couldn't be president. He couldn't fill the role of president. And Carter insisted on telling the American people when they deserved some of the blame for the fix the country was in. I think he was absolutely right. But being right doesn't get you anywhere. Being president might get you favorable treatment from historians. Reagan, because he saw things simpler than truth, he was able to get some traction on it.
The gentleman with the beard there?
Yes, sir.
You're taking me through a lot of unhappy memories. I had the misfortune to be a career foreign service officer who worked the eminent political interface with the career service throughout the Reagan years. I knew Reagan's eminence. I dealt with Reagan. I wrote a little bit for Reagan. I did the same thing with George Bush. When you're in the career service, that's what you do. The president's the president. I'd like to make a couple of comments. I just cannot swallow the concept that this was a great president. I say that because I don't want the younger people who didn't live through his presidency to believe it. But it's said over and over and over again. And you're very much in the line of Peggy Noonan, who was one of the speechwriters. This is the way she presents him. And I'd like to go into his character just a little bit. You're familiar with Isaiah Berlin's Hedgehog and the Fox. And what Isaiah Berlin said was that the hedgehog knows one thing.
Right.
The fox knows many things. Sometimes the hedgehog gets its way. Ronald Reagan was a hedgehog.
Right.
I think that's what you're saying. This is not shallow or deep. This is typing.
Okay.
And he was a fierce person when it came to what he considered to be his principles. He was cold as ice as a person, and this is where Edwin Morris failed in his biography because he didn't understand it. There's a peculiar type of personality, which is a mixture of the introverted and the extroverted. Ronald Reagan, who I worked for one of the people who could be called his friend. So I was very, very close to this whole thing. Ronald Reagan was an introvert. He was a gelid, frigid, ice-cold person inside. And Edwin Morris didn't understand that you can be that way as an introvert and really rely primarily on Nancy, as you've said, and still have this gregarious, friendly, Irish eloquence and manner. There are people like that, and Ronald Reagan was that kind of person.
Thank you. You want the speaker to comment on that?
Yeah, I would agree with you entirely. In fact, I wish I had been able to interview you because I would have used your quote about, we'll say, the gregarious exterior with the gelid interior. Because that's exactly right. As Reagan had no close friends, and he was, people who knew him only from what they saw on television, knew him from a distance, thought, what a friendly guy. But they got close, and they realized they couldn't get close. There was a coldness there. There was an aloofness. But let me just ask you, sort of press you on what you said at the beginning. Would you agree that there were great changes in the world during the Reagan presidency? Which is a slightly different thing than I'd said.
Well, it's hard for me as a professional who was involved in all these things in detail to look at it as I knew what Reagan's policies were, etc. And I was charged with implementing some of them. But I did talk to Reagan about this once. He didn't think that his military buildup was what pushed Gorbachev over the brink. It was really Gorbachev understanding that his system was collapsing. And had anybody been president, the Soviet Union was in the process of dissolution. I'll just give you one little anecdote about this. That is, almost everybody except Pat Moynihan got it wrong. They didn't understand the Soviet Union had no go anymore. It was dissolving. There was one other guy in Washington. I dealt with all the ideologues, all the crazy right-wingers, all the true believers, everybody. But there was one guy who understood that it really was collapsing. There was a sociologist named Murray Fishbach. And Murray Fishbach had little indicators. One of his indicators was toilet paper production in the Soviet. You know the story?
Yeah. But go ahead and tell it.
Well, when they didn't have enough money to produce adequate stocks of toilet paper, they were in deep and they didn't have that money. They didn't have the toilet paper. They were in trouble, and they were coming down. It was a total Potemkin village.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we should continue that conversation also after the question period.
Yeah, thank
this
you.
gentleman here to... Yes.
Well, I just wanted to pick up the toilet paper. I actually started this program for students. And students from Ukraine would come with toilet paper because they thought there would be no toilet paper in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I get some people on the fringes here? The lady over there, yeah.
So Obama started out as, his campaigning, he was this great communicator, and he was trying to be. I mean, I think he was very successful. And since then, it's besides all the other things that's wrong with him, he's either indifferent now, or he doesn't care. I don't know. But what do you think happened there? And also,
So it's a question whether Obama is as much a communicator as Reagan?
Did he really have potential to, really start communicating with the American people?
Having observed the evolution of the American political system over the last 40 years, I would say that there has never been a more difficult time to be president than now, and it's probably going to get worse. And it has a lot to do with the fact that the two parties have sifted out ideologically. Ronald Reagan was president at a time when there were still crossover votes. Reagan benefited greatly from Democrats, the Reagan Democrats. Democrats who, boll weevils in Congress. Democrats who would vote with a Republican president. And it had been the case earlier, Lyndon Johnson on civil rights reform got a lot of Republicans to vote. That's because as late as the 1980s, there were still such a thing as moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. But largely because Lyndon Johnson nailed the mast of the Democratic Party to civil rights reform, he alienated white Southern conservatives who had been a mainstay of the Democratic Party since Reconstruction. And that started the big migration, the great trek of Southerners of the South from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. Today, there is almost no middle ground. If you are a liberal in the United States today, you are a Democrat. If you are a conservative, you are a Republican. And there is no incentive for any Republican to do anything for Barack Obama. And it's almost sort of vice versa under George W. Bush. Well, the situation reversed. That and the perfecting, or you could call it the utter, the completion of gerrymandering. With computers, you can make congressional seats utterly safe for your party. So it's almost like the days in the South under Jim Crow, where the important elections were the Democratic primary elections. And that's where the decisions were made. In this day and age, that's true for most seats in Congress. The important election is the primary election. And if you are a Republican and you're interested in keeping your seat, you look only over your right shoulder, because the primary elections bring out the zealots. If you're a Democrat, you look over your left shoulder. So there is almost no middle ground anymore. So that's at the heart of the problem. Reagan could find some people across the aisle to deal with. There's another thing and that is that Barack Obama was the most brilliant campaigner and the most brilliant candidate that I've seen in quite a long time. And you will remember that his slogan was, "Yes, we can," which is exactly what you want people to believe when you're running for office. The trouble is that as soon as you get elected and inaugurated, the answer, the watchword is not anymore, "Yes, we can," it's "No, you can't." Because to govern is to choose, and most of the people who want something have to be told no. And Obama has not been able to make that transition. In part, Obama is a little bit too much like Jimmy Carter. He thinks things through too much, and he is, I'm going to say, is basically too honest. Whereas Reagan, I'm not going to say Reagan was dishonest, but this is where Reagan's, and I'll use the term now, Reagan's simple-mindedness comes into play. Because Reagan would say again and again, this is a great country. One of the striking things about Reagan, and here's a big contrast between John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. You remember Kennedy's inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Reagan never asked anything of the American people. Reagan complimented the American people, flattered the American people, and I'll give you a critical bit of evidence in this. Reagan had these two goals when he became president: shrink government at home, defeat communism abroad. Now, whether it was Reagan or not, communism wound up defeated. So, chalk one for the Reagan agenda, if not necessarily for Reagan himself. We can still debate that. On the side of shrinking government at home, for Reagan, shrinking government at home had two aspects. One, cut taxes, and two, cut spending. Now, until Reagan came along, the mark of a fiscal conservative, a Republican conservative, was their devotion to balanced budgets. You cut taxes and spending together. You don't cut taxes first, because everybody knows that's the easy part. The hard part is to cut spending. What Reagan did was to separate the two. Now, maybe Reagan really believed, if he did, he was pretty naive, but maybe he really believed that we can cut taxes first and then get Congress to cut spending. No. Congress is going to agree to cutting taxes, because if people don't like it, just blame it on the president. But people like having more money in their pockets. But then cutting spending, he never did get the spending cuts. And so, it's to Reagan that we owe the structural deficits that the country has been wrestling with for the last 30 years. Because from Reagan's time forward, Republican conservatives, their watchword on fiscal policy is cut taxes. And they've pretty much given up on balancing the budget in any meaningful sense.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Is there any indication of how Gorbachev appraised Reagan?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Gorbachev has a revealing memoir. And he talks about how, at least at first, he thought that Reagan was the worst of imperialist dinosaurs. Gorbachev thought that Reagan was as simple-minded, more simple-minded than even I have portrayed him. That he didn't know anything, and he just mouthed the words of his capitalist betters, the people who, the ruling circles in America. As Gorbachev got to know Reagan, he came to decide that Reagan was sincere. He came to, and since those of you who've had a career in diplomacy, I mean, you'd be much better able to speak to this than I can. The role of conversations, of getting to know people. Because it's tempting for the realist theorist to say, governments are black boxes and it doesn't really make any difference who's in power in the Kremlin, who's in power in the White House. Nations have interests, and those interests are what determine things. But at least in Reagan's case, it demonstrated that in Reagan and Gorbachev's case. They got to know each other, and Reagan came to believe that Gorbachev was a sincere reformer, and Reagan was, it's really interesting, Reagan would cite that Russian proverb again and again, trust but verify. And at the beginning, the emphasis was always on verify. But by the last months in office, it was really much more on trust. And there's a moment when he is asked, during the Moscow summit, it's late in his last year, where he is asked by somebody, does he still believe that the Soviet Union is an evil empire? And this is sort of that critical moment. And he says, no. And, well, you said it was. But those were different times. Things change. And that's the part that the Reagan loyalists don't want to remember. They remember Reagan beating the drums against the evil empire.
Thank you. Yeah, you, please.
You said that some of the previous presidents...
Can you speak up?
Some of the worst. You said that some of the best remembered presidents are the ones that inherited the worst situation.
Yeah.
So, do you think Nixon would have been remembered as one of the greats had it not been for Watergate?
Oh boy, this is where the question really arises. How important is fundamental integrity in a leader? And there are times when I think, in a president, maybe not that important, actually, because there are so many people who constrain a president, so many people who check up on a president. If the president is the kind of person who might steal money out of grocery store till as a clerk, well, you can't do that as president, so it's not going to happen. But there are moments when presidents can engage in obstruction of justice and maybe think they can get away with it. Nixon is a fascinating example to me, and I may actually wind up writing more about Nixon, because there is that dark streak about Nixon. But here's for me, the big puzzle about Nixon is why he went into politics at all. Because the typical political personality is one of a person who's gregarious, who likes people. And Nixon certainly strikes me. I never knew Richard Nixon, but from everything that I've observed and read about Nixon, he did not get along easily with people. There's a story about when Nixon is meeting with Golda Meir at the time when she was Prime Minister of Israel. And her foreign minister was Abba Eban. And you sort of have to know of Eban's Oxbridge education, and he spoke with an Oxbridge accent, English accent, and all this. At a time when when Nixon's Secretary of State was Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger. And so Nixon is trying to make small talk. What does he say? And so he says, well, Madam Prime Minister, you and I have something in common. And Mayor was, so what do I have in common with Richard Nixon? And he says, yes, Mr. President, what is that? And he says, we both have a Jewish foreign minister. And Meyer says, yes, but mine speaks English. So, I think I will give Nixon credit for, to my mind, knowing more and having thought more about international relations than any other American president, with the possible exception of Theodore Roosevelt. Nixon is that rare president who wanted to become president to change the world, not simply change the United States. If you look at the 44 presidents we've had, I could count on one hand and have a couple of fingers to spare presidents for whom the primary goal was to change foreign policy, and or for whom the principal issue in the election, if I count American elections, there are almost no elections where the primary consideration was foreign policy. We could argue 1916, maybe 1940, when there's a war going on. But even 1980, when Reagan gets elected, and a lot of people thought that the deciding factor was the hostages in Iran. Well, maybe. But more important was the dire state, the horrible state of the economy. And so, but Nixon's an exception to this. And so Nixon really knew a lot and thought a lot about foreign policy. So he's very interesting in that regard. As to why Nixon went into politics, I don't know. It's almost as though he went into politics because it was hard. If Nixon had been content merely to be rich and sort of mildly well-known, he could have been the most successful Wall Street lawyer in history. He had that kind of mind. He was that kind of smart. But he went into politics with just kind of cut against his grain. And it brought out all the insecurities and all the suspicions that finally emerged in Watergate. So that might be sort of a classic example of hubris, which would make him a great subject for biography.
We can take maybe two more questions. The lady over here.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Clinton versus Reagan in terms of performance of the presidency and connectiveness with people, because Clinton had that sparkly, magical thing, and I'm wondering, did Reagan have that sparkly, magical thing in the same?
Reagan did have that. But Clinton had it to an excess. And I think you can take it too far. But I will say this. This might sound like a really small thing. But I've alluded to various of Reagan's secrets of success. But one secret of Reagan's success was his ability to tell a joke. And I would say that Reagan might be the best joke teller in the history of the White House, with the possible exception of Abraham Lincoln, who told lots of jokes, but people who heard Lincoln's jokes didn't laugh. They just kind of groaned, oh my God, one of these hairy dog stories. But people laughed at Reagan's jokes. And Reagan understood a fundamental aspect of communication of human nature, and that is if you can get people to laugh with you, you're halfway to getting them to agree with you. And so even before hostile audiences, he would tell jokes. And it would soften things up. So there's that aspect of it. With Clinton, actually this gets back to what you were saying about Reagan, the cold personality, the cold reality under the apparently gregarious personality. Clinton is almost the opposite to an extreme. And with Reagan, there's something really interesting. Reagan seemed approachable, but only up to a point. But Reagan never seemed emotionally needy. Reagan would make his pitch. And various people would talk about when Reagan was trying to negotiate with members of Congress. And it was, he would lay out his policy and why he thought it was a good policy and say, I hope you will agree with us. And leave it at that. With Clinton, and I don't know Clinton, and I can't psychoanalyze Clinton any better than other people in the room, but Clinton always struck me as somebody who wanted everybody, maybe even now, wanted everybody to love him. Wanted to, why else would you run for governor of Arkansas, 8 times? Because when it comes right down to it, elections are popularity contests. And, Clinton seemed to me to have that kind of ego that needed stroking. And the other thing was, Clinton might be the most charismatic political figure of our living generation. But there is a point at which charisma puts people off because they feel themselves sort of falling under that sway and they don't want to be. The nickname for Clinton, Slick Willie. The people who use that, they realize this guy had those kind of skills. He really did feel your pain.
I shook his hand and my head almost exploded.
Yeah, well, that's exactly it. And it has a kind of, there's a reaction to that on the part of people who don't want to be drawn in. So people who do, fall under the sway, they're all in. They're all for him. And Clinton apparently still has that magic today.
We have to ask Hillary how she's coping.
Yeah.
But the lady here.
Yes, I wanted to ask you, do you know anything about Reagan's mother and his childhood with the mother?
Yes. Okay, so I told you about Reagan's father.
Yes.
Reagan's father was a drunk. And this is testified to by everybody who knows. He was a very charming drunk when he was sober. But he's very unreliable. Reagan's mother was the one who held the family together. And she was the one who understood that her younger son, she had 2 sons, Neil and Ronald. And Ronald was known as Dutch when he was a kid because to save money, she put the bowl over his head and cut the hair around it. And she learned, whether she sensed this before he did or not, it's hard to tell. But one of the reasons that Reagan went into show business, first in radio and then in movies, was that he discovered that for an awkward child, for one filled with anxiety, for one who had an older brother who was a really good athlete, when he himself was a lousy athlete, who was very nearsighted, he couldn't see a baseball, getting up in front of an audience and making them laugh was, as he said repeatedly, was music to his ears. He discovered what a lot of people who get up on stage discover, that their life, their real life, might be unsatisfactory. They might be fearful, they might be worried. But they get up on a stage and people respond. And for the moment, those anxieties go away. And Reagan himself talks about this in a couple of his memoirs, where this is what he learned on the stage of his mother's church. So her mom was a member of the Disciples of Christ, and she used to organize theatrical productions, a song and dance kind of thing, and she would put little Ronnie, little Dutch, up on stage. And they thought he was so cute. And in fact, this is back in the 1920s, in the golden age of movies, and he tells the story of, there was an aunt, his mother, his sister, somebody, who came and said they were watching some movie that had kid stars. And she says to Reagan's mother, why don't you take Dutch to Hollywood? He could do that. And Reagan himself professes to being utterly entranced by the movies. And those people up on the stage, they lived these charmed lives. And like one of the themes that I draw out in the book is, and when you write these things, I don't know if I could. Well, it's a theme, and I hope it works. But it's this, that one of the ways of interpreting Reagan's ambition, his rise in politics, because when you try to account for why people become president, ordinary people don't become president of the United States. There is a kind of ambition that pushes them forward. And lots of people are modestly ambitious, and they want to be best in their class, or they want to be CEO of a corporation. But to be president of the United States, that's ambition of another kind. And for certain individuals, the ambition takes the form of they want power. They want the ability to change the world. And you see that in Lyndon Johnson. People who knew Lyndon Johnson when he was young, when he was in college. And they would see, here's a guy who's hungry for power, and the power is going to fill some empty spot in his soul or something. And he's going to change the world, and he is going to... So he guides the Civil Rights Revolution of the 1960s. With Reagan, it wasn't that so much. What Reagan was looking for was not power. He was looking for applause. He was looking for a stage. And with Reagan, with each success, he looks for a bigger stage. So first is the stage of school plays, and then the stage of the radio broadcaster, the stage of Hollywood, and then the stage of politics in California, and then the stage of the presidency of the United States, and finally, when he gets together with Gorbachev, the stage of world history. And it's, talk about dramatic moments on stage, Reagan and Gorbachev at Reykjavik almost literally held the fate of the world in their hands. And they knew it. And if they could come to an agreement, and if they could make the agreement stick, then the future of the human race for the next 50 years might be different. And this is one of the reasons that Reagan was a pragmatist rather than this merely rhetorical ideologue. Because Reagan, by the time he got to that stage, he was now, the bigger stage was the stage of history. And he wanted to accomplish things. He didn't want to simply score political points. That's what had gotten him to this stage, but now the stage was even bigger. So that's sort of the way I interpret Reagan's ambition, what drove him up. A lot of people saw Reagan as ambitious, but it's a different kind of ambition than you see in, as I say, somebody like Lyndon Johnson.
Thank you. When is the book coming out?
In May, just in time, in fact, for Father's Day. So if there's...
we all want to buy it.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me thank Professor Brands for an excellent performance, for enlightening us about the weaknesses and strengths of Ronald Reagan. I would like to say that next semester we are continuing with our lecture series, and the first lecture will be on the 22nd of January, and there will be a lecture about Nazi Germany. And after that, there will be a lecture about the dirty war in Argentina, and there will be many more lectures, and a few ambassadors and other distinguished people will be coming to visit us. So I will send all that information out on the mailing list. For today, I would like to thank you for coming and wish you a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Thank you.